The most powerful phase of a life does not announce itself the way most people expect it to. It does not arrive as a sudden rush of opportunity, a dramatic reversal of fortune, or an external event that signals clearly, this is the moment everything changes. From a Jungian perspective, the most powerful phase of a human life arrives first as an interior event. Quiet, unmistakable to those who know what they are looking for, and frequently mistaken for something entirely different by those who do not. There are specific signs that precede this phase. They appear in particular configurations. And if you are reading this, there is a meaningful possibility that several of them are already present in your life right now, which is exactly why this found you when it did. The first thing to establish, because it determines everything that follows, is what the most powerful phase of a life actually means in Jung's framework, and what it does not mean. It does not mean the period in which external success peaks, in which the most resources are accumulated, or in which the most recognition arrives. Those things may or may not accompany it. But in Jung's model of psychological development, what constitutes genuine power is interior. It is the degree to which the full range of the psyche has been brought into conscious relationship, the degree to which the self, Jung's term for the totality of the psyche, far larger than the ego, has been able to express itself through a life. The most powerful phase is the one in which this expression becomes most complete. And the signs that precede it are signs of that completion approaching. The process Jung called individuation, the lifelong movement toward psychological wholeness, toward the integration of all the dimensions of the self that have been split off, denied, or left undeveloped, does not proceed at a constant pace. There are periods of relatively stable consolidation, where what has been gained is integrated and lived, and there are periods of accelerated transformation, where significant developmental thresholds are crossed in relatively compressed timeframes. The most powerful phase corresponds to one of these threshold crossings, specifically to the crossing that follows the most sustained and comprehensive engagement with the shadow, the inferior function, and the deeper layers of the unconscious that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It arrives, in other words, after the preparation is complete, and the signs tell you the preparation is almost there. It is important to understand why these 7 signs appear before the phase rather than during it. The reason is structural. The most powerful phase of psychological life requires a specific interior condition to become available, a degree of ego flexibility, shadow integration, and openness to the self that cannot be manufactured through effort or intention alone. It must be prepared for, often without knowing it is being prepared for, through precisely the kinds of experiences that most people most want to escape. The signs appear in the final stages of that preparation, when enough of the necessary interior work has been completed that the threshold is genuinely close. They are not promises, they are indicators. The difference matters, because seeing them clearly also means understanding what they require in return. And here is the paradox that Jung's framework surfaces consistently in the clinical material he worked with across decades. The signs that most reliably precede the most powerful phase of a life do not look like power. They look like dissolution. They look like confusion about identity, withdrawal from familiar patterns, relationships reorganizing in ways that feel destabilizing, old certainties losing their grip. The ego, which evaluates experience through the lens of its own preservation and its established sense of what constitutes success, consistently misreads the signs of approaching threshold as evidence of something going wrong. This is one of the reasons so many people reach the threshold of their most powerful phase and retreat from it, because the signs were present but were misread as warning rather than invitation. What follows is the corrected reading. Before we go further into this, if this kind of knowledge resonates with what you've been searching for, subscribe to the channel. This is where we do the deep work, the kind that actually changes something. The first sign is one of the most disorienting and most commonly misread. Your old identity no longer fits. The self you have been presenting to the world, the role you have occupied in your family, your profession, your social circle, begins to feel like clothing that has become too small. Not wrong, exactly, not false in any dramatic sense, but constraining in a way that has become impossible to ignore. You find yourself responding to familiar situations from a place that is slightly, and then increasingly, different from the place you have always responded from. Old conversations feel shallow. Old definitions of success feel insufficient. The self that was adequate for the life you have been living feels genuinely inadequate for what you sense, without yet being able to articulate, is coming. In Jung's framework, this experience corresponds precisely to what happens in the later stages of significant individuation, when the ego, which has been organized around a particular identity structure, begins to feel the pressure of the self pushing through that structure toward a more complete expression. The persona, Jung's term for the social mask, the identity constructed for successful functioning in the external world, is not a fabrication. It is a genuine and necessary structure. But it is always a partial expression of who the person actually is. And when the self is preparing for a significant expansion, the persona that has served the previous phase begins to crack at its edges. This cracking is not pathology. It is the self asserting the inadequacy of the previous container to hold what is now trying to emerge. The discomfort is the pressure of something larger, trying to move through a space that was sized for something smaller. The way this manifests in lived experience is specific enough to recognize. You may find that you cannot inhabit the familiar version of yourself as easily as you once could, that performing the role that once came naturally now requires a conscious effort that feels vaguely dishonest. You may find that what used to feel like your authentic self now feels like a position you are choosing to maintain rather than simply being. People who have known you for years may begin to notice something different about you without being able to name what it is. And you may experience a quality of grief about this, not because something is being lost that was valuable, but because identity, even an identity that has become too small, is familiar. What is important to understand is that this disorientation is not the problem. It is the sign. The old self is dissolving because a larger one is preparing to emerge. The second sign is one that Jung documented extensively, and that empaths in particular tend to recognize immediately. Synchronicities are multiplying, and they are becoming difficult to rationalize away. Where once you might have noticed an occasional coincidence, a meaningful encounter at an unexpected moment, a piece of information arriving precisely when it was most needed, you now find yourself in a sustained period where these alignments between interior experience and exterior events are occurring with a frequency and a precision that strains the credibility of the explanation. It's just coincidence. The same theme appears in a book you opened randomly, in a conversation you were not seeking, and in a dream in the same week. Something that has been occupying your interior life appears unexpectedly and with striking relevance in the external world. Jung developed the concept of synchronicity specifically to account for this phenomenon, not as supernatural intervention, but as a meaningful coincidence between psychic events and external events that share a common significance without sharing a causal connection. His framework suggests that synchronicities cluster most densely at points of significant psychological transition, when the unconscious is most actively working to bring something forward into consciousness, and when the threshold between the interior and exterior dimensions of experience becomes, in some sense, more permeable. The increase in synchronicities that precedes the most powerful phase of a life is, from this perspective, the unconscious's way of confirming the direction, of providing external correlates to the interior movement that is already underway, as if to say, with unusual insistence, that what is happening inside is aligned with what the larger field is preparing. If you recognize either of these signs in your life right now, the old identity feeling too small, the synchronicities becoming undeniable, write in the comments, "I am approaching something real." Because the recognition matters. It changes the relationship to what is happening. The specific quality of the synchronicities that precede this phase is worth attending to, because not every coincidence carries the same weight. The synchronicities that signal an approaching threshold tend to cluster around a specific theme, the theme of what the approaching phase is actually about. If what is being prepared is a significant creative emergence, the synchronicities will tend to cluster around creativity, around encounters with work that speaks directly to what is trying to come through you. If what is approaching is a relational transformation, the synchronicities will involve people, encounters, and messages organized around the specific quality of relationship that the new phase requires. Pay attention to the theme of what is multiplying, because it is telling you something precise about the nature of what is approaching, even before you have conscious language for it. The third sign is more subtle than the first two, and more easily misinterpreted as loss rather than arrival. What used to consume you no longer does. The things that once generated your strongest reactions, the ambitions that drove you, the fears that organized your avoidance, the relationships or situations that carried the most emotional charge, begin to lose a quality of urgency that you had previously taken for granted. This is not numbness. It is not depression. The distinction is important. Numbness is the absence of feeling. What this sign describes is the presence of a different quality of feeling, a quietness, a settling, a sense that the engine that was running at high intensity in a particular direction has completed its work and is shifting into a different mode. What the ego interprets as losing something is the psyche releasing what has served its purpose. Jung borrowed the concept of enantiodromia from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus to describe a principle he observed consistently in psychological development: the tendency of psychic energy to reverse direction when it reaches a point of extreme intensity. What has been driven to its furthest point begins, at that extreme, to turn into its opposite. The ambition that consumed 10 years of a life, when it has been pursued to its fullest possible extent, begins naturally to lose its compulsive quality and to open toward something that the ambition was always serving but never fully expressing. The fear that organized a person's defenses for decades, when it has finally been faced directly and metabolized, releases into the energy that was always bound inside it. Enantiodromia is not failure. It is completion. The sign that something has stopped consuming you is often the sign that the purpose it was serving has been fulfilled. The practical way to distinguish this sign from genuine apathy or depression is through what replaces the consuming drive rather than what is absent. In apathy and depression, the space left by the loss of drive is empty, flat, heavy, without direction or felt potential. In the enantiodromia that precedes the most powerful phase, the space is not empty. It carries a quality of openness, a sense of availability, as if the energy that was locked in the previous consuming direction has been released and is now present but not yet reorganized around its next direction. There may be a period of not knowing what comes next. This is normal. It is the moment between the out-breath and the in-breath, the pause in which the psychic energy is turning. What is important is to not fill that pause prematurely with something that merely replicates the previous consuming direction. The turning requires the space. The fourth sign is one that many people experience as concerning and others as a relief. You are being pulled inward. The appetite for social engagement, for external stimulation, for the kind of busy productivity that fills the hours with visible output, begins to diminish. Not from exhaustion, though exhaustion may accompany it, but from something more fundamental. A genuine orientation of attention toward the interior, a quality of being drawn toward solitude, reflection, and the kind of deep listening that is not possible in the midst of noise. You find yourself less interested in the surface of things and more interested in their meaning. You find yourself sitting with questions rather than reaching for immediate answers. You find yourself, in moments of genuine quiet, sensing something in the interior landscape that the noise of ordinary life consistently drowns out. Jung documented this inward pull as a consistent feature of the approach to major developmental thresholds, and gave it a specific psychological context through his reference to the Nekia, the hero's descent into the underworld that appears across mythologies as the necessary prelude to emergence with a new order of power. The Nekia is not a failure of engagement with life. It is what happens when the psyche requires a period of concentrated interior work, of meeting what has been avoided, integrating what has been split off, consolidating what has been developed, before it can function at a new level. The withdrawal from the external field is not retreat. It is the gathering of resources for what is coming. The psyche is, in the period of the inward pull, doing the most significant work of the transformation, and it requires the interior space to do it. The distinction between this healthy inward pull and avoidance or depression is again qualitative rather than structural. Avoidance feels like fleeing. There is a quality of running from something, of choosing the interior because the exterior feels threatening rather than because the interior feels genuinely necessary. Depression feels like incapacity, the inability to engage, the absence of felt aliveness. The inward pull that precedes the most powerful phase feels different from both. It carries a quality of rightness, even when it is unfamiliar. There is aliveness in the interior space, a sense of something genuinely present and genuinely important happening there. The person experiencing this sign often finds that they are more productive in their interior life during this period than they have been in years, more connected to what matters, more able to access depth, even as their external output and social engagement temporarily diminish. The fifth sign operates in the relational field rather than the interior one, and it is among the most unmistakable. The relationships around you are reorganizing. Some relationships that have been stable for years are beginning to feel strained in ways that cannot be attributed to any specific conflict. Some people who were peripheral are moving closer, with an ease and a depth that surprises you. Some relationships that once felt essential are quietly losing the urgency they once carried. And some new connections are arriving with a quality of recognition, a sense of meeting someone who belongs to the next chapter rather than the previous one, that feels different in kind from ordinary new acquaintance. The relational field is not reorganizing because of anything you have consciously chosen. It is reorganizing because you are reorganizing. Jung's framework for understanding this phenomenon is rooted in a principle he observed consistently, that the psychological field of a person extends beyond their individual skin and influences and is influenced by the psychological fields of those around them. When the center of a person's psychological life shifts significantly, the entire relational matrix organized around the previous center must reorganize accordingly. This is not the same as outgrowing people, which is a concept that carries more judgment than accuracy. It is more precisely a matter of coherence. Some of the people who were deeply coherent with the previous configuration of the self become less coherent with the emerging one, while others, who may have felt slightly out of reach or not quite relevant, become suddenly and naturally aligned. The change in the relational field is a direct reflection of the change in the interior field, a mirror held at the level of relationship of who you are becoming. If this is opening something for you, if you're recognizing these signs in your own life right now, let me know by liking this video. It tells me this work is landing where it needs to. The most important thing to understand about this relational reorganization is that it is not a verdict on the value of the relationships that are changing or dissolving. A relationship that was genuinely meaningful and genuinely served an important period of a life does not become retroactively less valuable because it does not belong to the next period. The difficulty is that the relational reorganization accompanying a significant psychological threshold can feel like loss, abandonment, or failure, because that is how the ego tends to interpret it when it does not have a framework for understanding what is actually happening. With the Jungian framework in place, the same experience reads differently, not as the end of something valuable, but as the natural consequence of genuine growth, the kind that changes not just what you think, but who you actually are, in ways that the relational field cannot help but reflect. The sixth sign is perhaps the one that carries the deepest significance, and that is most consistently underestimated. Old fears are losing their grip, not disappearing. This distinction matters enormously. The fears themselves may still be present, still recognizable, still occasionally activated, but they have lost something fundamental: their authority. The fear that for years organized significant life decisions, that shaped which opportunities were pursued and which were avoided, that determined the ceiling on what felt possible, that fear is still there, but it no longer determines the outcome. You find yourself moving forward through it rather than being stopped by it. You find yourself noticing it without being controlled by it. The fear has not been conquered. Something more significant has happened. It has been integrated, which means it has lost the unconscious power that came from being unexamined. This shift is exactly what Jung's framework predicts as the outcome of sustained engagement with shadow material. The shadow, the repository of everything the conscious ego has refused to acknowledge about itself, derives its power from remaining unconscious. A fear that has never been directly faced, never been metabolized, never been brought into clear conscious awareness and examined in its actual dimensions, operates as an autonomous complex. It acts on the psyche from below the threshold of consciousness, determining responses and closing doors without ever being seen clearly enough to be evaluated. The work of shadow integration, which is not a single dramatic event, but a sustained process of bringing the contents of the shadow into the light of conscious awareness, progressively removes this autonomous power. The fear does not disappear. It becomes available, and what is available can be worked with in ways that what is autonomous cannot. The specific quality of this sign in lived experience is distinct from other ways that fears can seem to diminish. Suppression makes fear temporarily quieter, but leaves it intact and operational below the surface. Avoidance manages fear by organizing life around its perimeter, which preserves the fear's authority while reducing the occasions for its activation. What shadow integration produces is qualitatively different. The fear is present, visible, recognized, and it no longer determines what is possible. You can feel afraid and act anyway, not through willpower or self-overcoming in the conventional sense, but because the fear has lost the quality of absolute authority it once carried. This is the sign that the unconscious power of the shadow has diminished, which is the specific interior condition that makes the most powerful phase of a life available. The territory that the fear was guarding becomes accessible precisely when the fear is integrated rather than conquered. The seventh sign is the most difficult to describe in ordinary language, and the most unmistakable to those who are experiencing it. You sense something approaching. Not a specific event, not an identifiable outcome, not something that can be named in the language of goals and plans. Something larger, a quality of potential, a sense of proximity to something significant that has not yet taken visible form. This sense arrives in moments of genuine quiet, in the space between sleeping and waking, in the aftermath of an experience that touched something deep. It is not wishful thinking which has a quality of anxious reaching. It has a quality of reception, of something arriving from a direction that is not quite the ordinary future, carrying a weight of significance that exceeds what the ego's plans and ambitions could account for. In Jung's terms, this is the approach of the numinosum. The numinosum, a term Jung borrowed from the theologian Rudolf Otto, describes the quality of experience that signals proximity to what Jung understood as the self, the totality of the psyche, the organizing principle that stands behind and exceeds the ego. The numinous quality is not supernatural in origin in Jung's framework, but it is not merely personal either. It is the felt presence of the deeper levels of the psyche becoming more accessible, the approach of a dimension of interior experience that is larger than the ordinary ego, and that carries therefore a quality of significance and weight that ordinary experience does not carry. When the most powerful phase of a life is approaching, this quality becomes perceptible, not as certainty about what is coming, but as a palpable sense that something is. The self is, in this reading, making itself felt before it makes itself visible. The appropriate response to this seventh sign is the most counterintuitive of all the appropriate responses to the seven. Not to reach for it, not to define it prematurely, not to try to organize it into a plan or a timeline, but to receive it. The numinous quality that signals the approach of the most powerful phase is easily destroyed by the ego's characteristic response to significant experience, which is to immediately attempt to manage and control it. The sense of something approaching requires what might be called receptive attention, a quality of open, unhurried presence that allows the approaching thing to arrive at its own pace, rather than being forced into premature form by the ego's impatience. Jung consistently observed that what the ego grabs too quickly is diminished by the grabbing. What is allowed to arrive in its own time arrives whole, and what arrives whole changes things in ways that what is prematurely seized never can. If you've been recognizing these signs for a while, but still feel like something is blocking the actual crossing of the threshold, like the phase is close, but not quite arriving, I left something specific for that in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are done waiting and are ready to move through what remains between where they are and where they sense they are going. With all seven signs named and placed, it becomes possible to describe more precisely what the most powerful phase of a life actually is in Jungian terms. Not as an external period of exceptional fortune or opportunity, but as a specific interior condition that, once established, changes the quality of everything that flows through it. It is the condition in which the ego and the self are in the most direct and functional relationship they have yet achieved, in which the full range of the psyche, including dimensions that were previously split off or operating autonomously from below the threshold of awareness, has been brought into a degree of conscious integration that makes it available rather than merely influential. Power, in this framework, is not the accumulation of resources. It is the degree to which the full range of who you actually are can be expressed, directed, and brought to bear on whatever you choose to engage with. The relationship between what has been endured before this phase and what becomes available during it is not accidental. Jung's framework is explicit about the mechanism. The suffering that characterizes the periods preceding the most powerful phase is the specific form through which the necessary interior work gets done. Confronting the shadow, meeting the fears, the wounds, the capacities that were suppressed, the aspects of the self that were deemed unacceptable and pushed below the threshold of awareness, is not comfortable work. It is often the most uncomfortable experience a person undergoes, but the psychic energy that was bound in maintaining those repressions, in keeping the shadow material at a distance, is released through the work of integration. And the release of that bound energy is precisely what produces the felt sense of power that characterizes the most powerful phase. The phase is powerful because the energy that was previously locked in the work of denial becomes available for the work of living. One of the most distinctive and practically significant features of the most powerful phase is what might be called psychological authority, a quality of interior solidity and directedness that is fundamentally different from the confidence that comes from external validation or accumulated achievement. Psychological authority does not depend on being agreed with. It does not require external confirmation to remain stable. It is not diminished by criticism, by setback, or by the disapproval of others, because it does not derive from any of those external sources. It derives from the depth of the relationship between the ego and the self, from the quality of integration achieved through the work that preceded this phase. A person operating from genuine psychological authority is not louder or more assertive than others. They are simply clearer. And that clarity, grounded in something the ego alone cannot manufacture, is felt by everyone in proximity to it. What makes the most powerful phase experientially distinct, what produces the qualities of authority, clarity, and directed energy that characterize it, is the strengthening of what Jung called the ego-self axis, the functional relationship between the conscious ego and the totality of the psyche that the self represents. When this axis is weak or disrupted, as it tends to be during the shadow-heavy periods that precede the powerful phase, the ego functions in relative isolation from the deeper resources of the psyche, relying primarily on what conscious effort, strategy, and accumulated knowledge can provide. When the axis strengthens, as the result of sustained individuation work, the ego begins to function as a receiver and a vehicle for the self, rather than as an isolated operator. Decisions align with something deeper than preference. Actions carry a quality of conviction that comes from below the level of reasoning, and the results reflect a coherence between what the conscious mind chooses and what the full psyche is actually capable of. The most powerful phase is also, in many cases, the culmination of an enantiodromia at the scale of an entire developmental period, not the small daily reversals of mood and energy, but the great turning of an extended arc of psychological life. After years of pressure, restraint, difficulty or sustained confrontation with what was most challenging, the psychic energy that has been compressed by that pressure reaches its natural turning point and begins to move in the direction of its opposite. The long winter of the inner work produces in this turning something that resembles spring, not as an external metaphor, but as an accurate description of the felt quality of the shift. What was heavy becomes lighter without losing its depth. What was effortful becomes natural without losing its precision. What was constricted begins to expand, not randomly, but in exact proportion to what was compressed. The most powerful phase is not a gift. It is the accurate consequence of everything that came before it. One of the most important things Jung's framework establishes about the most powerful phase is what cannot be done to produce it. It cannot be forced. The tools of the ego, effort, strategy, will, positive thinking, the application of more pressure in the direction of the desired outcome, are not capable of manufacturing the interior condition that this phase requires. They can support the preparation, They can maintain the consistency of the interior work. But the crossing of the threshold itself, the moment in which the ego self-axis strengthens sufficiently for the phase to become available, is not something the ego can produce through effort. It can only recognize it when it arrives and choose to receive it rather than deflect it through the habits of the previous phase. This is, paradoxically, one of the most difficult things for people who have worked hard for a long time to accept, that the most important thing now is not to work harder, but to receive what the work has made possible. One of the less discussed but highly reliable signs that the most powerful phase has arrived, or is very close, is the emergence of what Jung called the inferior function, the least developed of the four cognitive functions, which in most people remains largely unconscious throughout the earlier decades of life. In a person for whom thinking has been the dominant function, the inferior function is feeling. In a sensation type, it is intuition. What makes this emergence significant is that the inferior function, precisely because it has remained less colonized by the ego's habitual patterns, tends to carry an unusual freshness and depth when it finally begins to emerge into accessibility. The person who has been entirely a thinker, who suddenly discovers a genuine capacity for emotional depth, or the person who has been entirely practical, who suddenly discovers genuine intuitive capacity, these experiences signal not a loss of what was previously developed, but the completion of a psychological range that was always present but only partially available. It's important to address a common misunderstanding about what the most powerful phase means for the shadow material that preceded it. Integration does not mean elimination. The shadow does not disappear when the most powerful phase arrives. If it did, the person would no longer be human, which is neither possible nor desirable in Jung's framework. What changes is the relationship. The shadow material that was autonomous, operating from below the threshold of consciousness, determining responses and limiting possibilities without being seen or examined, becomes, through the work of integration, a known quantity. It is no longer hidden from the conscious self, and therefore no longer capable of acting as an autonomous complex. The fears are known. The wounds are metabolized. The capacities that were repressed are in the process of being reclaimed. This known and metabolized shadow is not a danger. It is, paradoxically, one of the sources of the depth and authenticity that characterizes the most powerful phase, because it has been lived through rather than avoided. But here is where the framework requires a note of genuine caution, because the most powerful phase carries a specific risk that the previous, more difficult phases did not carry in the same way. Jung called it psychological inflation, the state in which the ego, encountering the expanded energy and sense of possibility that the strengthened ego self-axis produces, mistakes that expansion for its own achievement and begins to identify with what actually belongs to the self rather than to the ego. The person in psychological inflation does not feel humble. They feel exceptional, specially chosen, uniquely gifted, elevated above the ordinary. This state is not the most powerful phase. It is a danger that the most powerful phase, if met without appropriate psychological consciousness, can produce. The genuine most powerful phase is accompanied not by a sense of superiority, but by a quality of responsibility, a deepened sense of what is required, not a diminished sense of what is owed. The specific form of sabotage most likely to interrupt the most powerful phase in its early stages is premature action, the impulse to immediately translate the expanded interior state into visible external moves before the interior consolidation is complete. The ego, encountering a surge of energy and clarity that it has not experienced in this form before, tends to want to deploy it immediately, to launch, to announce, to build, to make the interior change visible in external form as quickly as possible. Jung's framework consistently cautions against this impulse. The most powerful phase in its early stages is still consolidating. The foundation is being established. Moving too quickly before that foundation is solid tends to produce structures that cannot bear the weight of what is built on them. Not because the energy or the vision is insufficient, but because the interior integration that needs to underpin external action has not yet completed its work. What is required during the most powerful phase itself, not only in the preparation for it, is a continuation of the interior work, not its abandonment. This is counterintuitive for many people who imagine that the most powerful phase represents a graduation from the difficult interior work that preceded it. In one sense, it does. The intensity of the shadow confrontation, the sustained discomfort of meeting what was most difficult, does diminish. But the commitment to interior honesty, to continued engagement with what the unconscious is communicating, to the ongoing refinement of the relationship between ego and self, these do not end with the arrival of the phase. They become the ongoing practice that sustains it. The most powerful phase is not a destination at which the work stops. It is a new level at which the work continues, with greater resources, greater depth, and a far more functional relationship with the full range of the psyche. One of the most tangible ways the most powerful phase manifests in observable behavior is in the changed quality of presence that the person brings to their relationships and encounters. Presence, the degree to which a person is genuinely available, genuinely attentive, genuinely there, is directly connected to the degree of interior integration that underlies it. A person who is managing significant unintegrated shadow material, whose attention is partly occupied by the autonomous complexes operating below the threshold of awareness, is never fully present. Some portion of their attention and energy is always engaged in the management of what remains unconscious. As the shadow integrates and the ego self-axis strengthens, this management overhead decreases. The result is a quality of presence that is noticed by those around the person, a sense of being genuinely seen, genuinely met, genuinely engaged with, that produces effects in relationship that effort and intention alone cannot replicate. The most powerful phase produces observable changes in creative and professional domains that are not the result of increased effort or newly acquired skills, but of the increased availability of the full psychological range that was previously only partially accessible. Creative work produced during this phase tends to carry a depth and an authenticity that work from earlier phases, however technically accomplished, did not carry in the same way, because it draws on interior resources that were not previously accessible. Professional engagement changes in character. Decisions that once required extended deliberation arrive with an ease and a clarity that is not recklessness, but alignment. The alignment between what the conscious mind chooses and what the full psyche is actually capable of and genuinely oriented toward. The quality of what is produced in this phase is not simply better. It is different in kind. It carries the signature of a whole person rather than a partially integrated one. The body participates in the most powerful phase in ways that are specific enough to notice. As the bound psychic energy that maintained repressions and sustained the defensive structures of the previous configuration begins to release, the body often experiences a corresponding shift, a quality of physical ease and availability that was not present during the periods of intense interior pressure. This is not a claim about health in a medical sense. It is a description of something more subtle, a quality of embodied aliveness, of inhabiting the physical self more fully and more comfortably, that tends to accompany the kind of psychological integration that the most powerful phase represents. People in this phase often describe feeling, for the first time in years or perhaps ever, genuinely at home in their bodies. As if the interior work has, among its other effects, resolved a quality of fundamental tension between the psychological and the physical that they had previously normalized as simply how existence felt. The most powerful phase, when it has genuinely arrived, is recognizable not through drama, but through a specific quality of interior coherence that is unlike anything that came before it. It does not feel like winning. It does not feel like relief, exactly, though relief may be one component. It feels most accurately like alignment, a sense that what you are doing, who you are being, and what the deeper layers of the psyche are actually oriented toward are all moving in the same direction for the first time in memory, or perhaps for the first time ever. There is a quality of arriving at a self that fits, not perfectly, not without edges and challenges, but genuinely. The person who has crossed into the most powerful phase does not typically announce it. They simply begin to operate from it. And the difference becomes visible in the quality of what they produce, the quality of how they are present, and the quality of what they attract into their lives. And final caution deserves naming: the danger of recognizing these signs and then retreating from what they point toward. This retreat is more common than might be expected, and it takes a specific form. The person recognizes that a significant threshold is approaching. They feel the inward pull, they notice the relational reorganization, they sense the numinosum, and then, confronted with the unfamiliarity of what is coming and the genuine demands it places on the interior life, they choose the known over the unknown. They rebuild the old identity structure rather than allowing the dissolution to complete. They return to the familiar relationships rather than following the reorganization to its natural conclusion. They suppress the sense of something approaching rather than learning to receive it. Jung's framework is clear about what this produces. Not stability, but stagnation. The freezing of a developmental process that the psyche will eventually resume at greater cost, because the pressure of the self does not diminish when the ego retreats. It waits. One of the questions that naturally arises when these 7 signs are named and recognized is why now? Why does this phase arrive when it does, rather than earlier or later? The answer in Jung's framework involves what might be called an accumulation principle, the understanding that psychological development, unlike many forms of learning, requires the actual living of certain experiences before the next level becomes available. The most powerful phase cannot arrive before the shadow work has reached a certain depth, not because the universe is withholding it as a reward, but because the interior condition it requires cannot be manufactured or skipped. It requires the actual integration of what has been avoided, the actual confrontation with what has been feared, the actual dissolution of the identities that were too small. This integration takes the time it takes, not a day longer in most cases, but also not a day less. The phase arrives when the accumulation is sufficient, not before. It's worth being precise about what distinguishes the most powerful phase from ordinary good periods, from stretches of external success, creative productivity, or relational satisfaction that most people experience periodically throughout their lives. Ordinary good periods are primarily externally driven. They arise when circumstances are favorable, when effort is well directed and meets a responsive environment, when relationships are in good repair and support is available. They are real and they are valuable, but they are not the most powerful phase in Jung's sense because they do not require and do not produce the specific interior transformation that the most powerful phase both requires and generates. They can be interrupted by a change in circumstances. The most powerful phase, because its foundation is interior rather than external, carries a resilience that ordinary good periods do not carry. It is not immune to external difficulty, but it is not destroyed by it either, because what it is built on cannot be taken away by the movement of external conditions. The distinction between psychological power and worldly success is one that Jung insisted upon consistently, and it is one that the culture most people live in consistently collapses. Worldly success, the accumulation of resources, recognition, status, and influence, is not inherently incompatible with the most powerful phase, and can in fact be one of its expressions. But it is not its measure. A person can occupy the highest levels of worldly success while operating from a level of psychological development that corresponds to a much earlier phase, driven by unintegrated shadow material, organized around a persona that has never been examined, operating without functional access to the deeper resources of the self. And a person can be in the most powerful phase of their psychological life, while their external circumstances appear modest by the standards the culture applies. What determines the phase is interior. What the interior produces will, over time, tend to manifest in the exterior. But the sequence matters. The interior condition is the source. The external expression is the consequence. The specific shift in interior authority that most clearly distinguishes the most powerful phase from all previous periods is difficult to describe, but unmistakable to experience. A quality of knowing what you are for, not in the sense of a defined mission or a stated purpose. The language of goals and objectives is too thin to capture it, but in the sense of a felt clarity about where your actual weight lies, what you are genuinely capable of, what you are genuinely oriented toward, what you are, in the deepest available sense, here to do. This clarity does not arrive through reasoning or planning. It is not the product of reflection on values or a careful assessment of strengths and weaknesses. It arrives as a kind of recognition, the feeling of something settling into place that was always the actual shape of you, now visible for the first time with sufficient clarity to be lived from. This is the most significant interior experience the most powerful phase produces. Entering the most powerful phase of a life brings with it a form of responsibility that is different in quality from the responsibilities of earlier phases. The earlier responsibilities were primarily external, to others, to roles, to the commitments made from a smaller and less integrated self. The responsibility that accompanies the most powerful phase is more fundamental. The responsibility of becoming what you have been prepared to be. This is not grandiosity. It is the specific and personal responsibility of not retreating from the full extent of what you are now capable of bringing the full range of the developed self to bear on whatever you engage with, rather than continuing to operate from the comfortable partial version. The world around you does not need you at your most managed and most careful version of yourself. It needs what the years of interior work have actually produced. Entering the most powerful phase means accepting the obligation to deliver that. The majority of people who encounter the signs of the most powerful phase do not recognize them as such. And the primary reason is cultural rather than psychological. The culture that most people inhabit has a deeply embedded set of assumptions about what power looks like, and those assumptions are almost entirely externally oriented. Power is visibility. Power is accumulation. Power is the capacity to influence large numbers of people in measurable ways. By these standards, the signs that precede and characterize the most powerful phase in Jung's sense, the inward pull, the old identity dissolving, the relational reorganization, the quiet sense of something approaching, read as weakness rather than strength, as retreat rather than advance, as loss rather than arrival. The framework required to read them accurately is not the dominant framework of the culture. This is why the Jungian understanding of this material is not merely interesting. For the person standing at the threshold of this phase, it is genuinely necessary. The signs you have been carrying, perhaps for months, perhaps for years, were never pointing toward the wrong destination. The dissolution of the old identity was not evidence of failure. The inward pull was not avoidance. The relationships reorganizing were not loss. The fears losing their grip were not numbness. The sense of something approaching was not delusion. All of it, the entirety of what felt most confusing, most disorienting, most unlike what you thought progress was supposed to look like, was pointing precisely here, to this threshold, to this moment of recognition. And the fact that you are recognizing it now, that you have the framework to read what has been happening as preparation rather than as catastrophe, is itself part of what makes the threshold crossable. Understanding changes the relationship to experience, and a changed relationship to experience changes what experience makes possible. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that you recognize these signs. Recognition of this kind is not random. The capacity to receive and make sense of what is described here, to feel its accuracy, to map it onto your own interior landscape with a quality of genuine resonance rather than merely intellectual interest, is itself a feature of the phase approaching. The person who has not yet done the necessary interior work receives descriptions like these with intellectual curiosity, but not with the felt sense of recognition. That felt recognition is the sign of sufficient preparation. It means the material that is being described has been at least partially lived. You recognize the dissolution of the old identity because you have been living it. You recognize the sense of something approaching because you have been sensing it. The recognition confirms the preparation. The preparation makes the crossing possible. Jung was consistent in his observation that the timing of the individuation process, including the arrival of the most powerful phase, is not arbitrary, not primarily influenced by external circumstances, and not subject to acceleration through the application of will. It arrives when the interior work that precedes it has reached the point of sufficient completion. Not perfect completion. Jung was equally clear that perfectionism in the service of psychological development is itself a defense against development, a way of ensuring that the threshold is never actually reached by making the conditions for crossing it impossibly demanding. The most powerful phase does not require a flawless shadow integration, a perfectly developed inferior function, or a fully resolved history of wounding. It requires sufficient integration, enough that the interior condition supports a qualitatively different level of engagement with the full range of the self. And sufficient integration is not a fixed quantity. It is whatever the specific person in their specific life has actually accumulated through the work they have actually done. The most powerful phase of a life is not an endpoint. It is a new platform, a qualitatively different level of interior organization from which the subsequent decades of life are lived. What it builds toward, in Jung's framework, is not a final destination of psychological completion. No such destination exists, and the pursuit of it is itself a form of inflation. What it builds toward is a life lived from a depth and a wholeness that were not previously available. Relationships entered from genuine fullness rather than from need. Creative work produced from the full range of the psyche rather than from its most defended portions. Decisions made from the alignment of ego and self rather than from the ego's isolation. A quality of presence brought to every encounter that reflects what years of interior work actually produce when it is sustained, honest, and genuinely engaged. This is what the most powerful phase makes possible, and what it makes possible is not trivial. The invitation, and it is an invitation, not a demand, because the threshold cannot be forced and the crossing must be chosen, is to meet what is coming with the full weight of what you have become. Not the version of yourself that was adequate for the previous phase, not the careful, managed, partial self that has been the public face of a much larger interior life. The version that the years of interior work have been building toward, the one that carries the marks of what has been lived through, the depth of what has been integrated, the clarity that shadow work produces when it is done honestly and sustained over time. This version is not more impressive in a visible way. It does not require admiration. It simply operates from a different foundation. And that different foundation changes the quality of everything built on it. The invitation is to stop presenting the smaller version and to let what has actually been built become the basis from which you live. The most powerful phase of your life was never, in Jung's framework, primarily about what you would achieve, accumulate, or be recognized for. It was always about who you would become capable of being, the quality of human being that extended engagement with the depths of the psyche, sustained honest confrontation with the shadow, and the gradual strengthening of the relationship between ego and self actually produces. What you will do from this phase, the choices you will make, the work you will produce, the relationships you will enter, the contributions you will bring, these are consequences of the interior condition. They are not the point. The point is the interior condition itself, the quality of a life lived from a self that has been met in its fullness, faced in its difficulty, and brought, through sustained and honest work, into the most complete integration it has yet achieved. That is the most powerful phase, and it is not in the future. It is in the completion of what has already been underway. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I am ready for this phase." That declaration carries more weight than it may seem, and making it changes the relationship to what is coming. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now that continues exactly where this one ends. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.